H. Edward Flentje. From 1979 through the spring of 2014, Ed Flentje served as a professor in the Hugo Wall School of Public Affairs at Wichita State University and is currently Professor Emeritus at the university. He specializes in state and local government, state and local relations, and Kansas political culture. While on leave from the university, Flentje served as chairman of the transition team for Governor-elect Mike Hayden and as secretary of administration in Governor Hayden's cabinet, which was 1986 to 88. Flentje also served as director of the Division of State Planning and Research in the administration of Governor Robert F. Bennett, 1975 to 79. And as legislative assistant to U.S. Senator James B. Pearson of Kansas, 1968 and 69. Flentje also served as interim city manager for the city of Wichita in 2008 and as interim president of Emporia State University in 2011. Flentje is a native Kansan, born and raised in Harper County, which is west of here. So, if you would, let's give him a good welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Jan. You read that perfectly as I wrote it. I do feel feel quite welcome when I come to Cowley County. I feel like a neighbor, having grown up not too far west of here. And over a number of years during my work at Wichita State University as an active professor, worked with local officials here, and so I certainly feel welcome here. And let me commend Women for Kansas for engaging folks in issues and being on the forefront of change and education of citizens throughout Kansas, but particularly here, what you've done here in Cowley County. So I commend you. My dear wife joined me this morning. She introduced herself, but wanted you to know she joined me. You will hear, and maybe have heard already, a gathering called Restore Kansas that she is actively involved in. You may want to ask her about that. I think that's coming up later this month. Jan was asking me, well, what are you going to talk about? And if you follow any of the commentary I've had on Kansas, I often weigh in on state finance. I might add the disastrous condition of state finance, unbalanced budgets, unfair taxes, and excessive debt. And I'll be happy to speak to those if you have questions on that. It seems to be getting worse all the time. But I suggested that I comment on an issue that sometimes gets a little lost with all the noise of a presidential campaign and all the discussion about state finance. And actually that's an issue that's one of your items. a court system free from political influence. And so when it's not a subject I've spent much time on, I mean, I'm a political scientist, so I should know something about it. But once I decided to spend time on that topic here, I did a column on it, and if you're into the internet, you can find it out there, and I might be a little redundant, but here you can ask questions about it, not just read it, and there will be a couple wrinkles that are a little different. But kind of first start with the question, what do we expect of courts? Your organization says courts should be free from political influence, but what do we expect from courts? And we could just kind of open that to discussion, but I'm gonna kind of address that question by quoting one of the founders of our country, Alexander Hamilton, in probably one of the more important Federalist Papers, Federalist Papers number 78. And he addressed this question of what we expect from courts with amazing clarity, and I'm going to quote that. No legislative act contrary to the Constitution can be valid. A Constitution is in fact and must be regarded by the judges as a fundamental law. It therefore belongs to the judges to ascertain its meaning, as well as the meaning of any particular act proceeding from the legislative body. Essentially saying the Constitution belongs to the people. And one of the primary duties of our courts is to interpret that fundamental law, that primary document, in behalf of citizens. And so, what does that mean? Well, I thought I might just review a few of the happenings this week that could, if they were carried to fruition, would come into the court system, would require the courts to address them. And bear with me as I do a weekend review. On Monday, the Senate committee considered action on a bill defining grounds for impeachment of judges as any attempt to, quote, usurp executive or legislative authority. And later in the week it moves forward. Essentially, if this bill does pass, it will be challenged in the courts. And the judges will have to weigh in on it. On Wednesday, there were the first introduction of a bill to address the equalization issue that has been ordered by courts. And of course, whatever legislative action is taken, that will end up again back in our courts. Also on Wednesday, seems to be a big day, the Senate committee hears a bill to transfer the administration of school finance from the Department of Ed to the Department of Administration under the governor's control. clearly, that issue, if it went forward, would require the courts to weigh in and interpret the Constitution. And we can talk about that. I brought a copy of the Kansas Constitution along, just in case we need to look at that language. On Wednesday again, the newspaper reported that the Kansas Department of Health and Environment was slow to find a legal way to carry out the governor's order, quote, that not a single dollar of taxpayer money goes to Planned Parenthood, unquote. In other words, the governor orders this. I'm reading between the lines. The folks in the department know this cannot easily be done legally, and so the governor's orders kind of hit some rough sailing. Also on Wednesday, very active day, the full House considers a bill restricting refugees from settling in a community. And that was an interesting discussion, but here again, if action were taken on that, that would likely end up in the court system. So a busy Wednesday. On Thursday, the Senate, the impeachment bill was sent to the full Senate floor. So that's moving. On Thursday also, there were debates to override this power plant action taken by the governor, which likely could end up in court, maybe not a constitutional issue, but a equity issue. On Thursday also, the refugee bill got heard, and interestingly, because it's usually churches who are the intermediaries for settling refugees, the opponents of the bill said this is a religious liberty issue. You're trying to restrict churches' religious liberty. So that got sent back to committee. And then also on Thursday, the chairman of the committee, considering that transfer of school finance, canceled hearings. So Wednesday seems to be one of those highlights where we throw out stuff that could end up in the courts. Thursday, some wiser heads prevail in some cases. The point, though, is that in addressing the issue of what we expect from courts, when the legislature's in town, who knows what's going to happen next, and particularly the legislature we have now. And many of the issues they are trying to push forward are simply in some questionable status with the Constitution and need to be addressed. So, how has Kansas organized to provide for courts? Way back when the Wyandotte Constitution was written in 1859, we did what the nation did and what every state has done. We set up independent judiciary, separate and independent judiciary. We haven't changed the Constitution that much since then in comparison to all the amendments we've had to the Kansas Constitution. There are really just two that are significant today. One happened in 1957, and that set up the structure for selecting judges. And it's kind of an intriguing political story. We can talk about it if you wish. It's called the triple play, but it was an instance of gubernatorial abuse of power, and Kansans reacted quickly and forcefully to it. But what they did was say, we want a merit system for selecting judges, and established in the Constitution a nominating commission to review applications for judges and provide the governor, in each case, when there's a vacancy, with with 3 nominees from which the governor could appoint one. And the language of the Constitution says that no party official should be eligible for service on the nominating commission. Pretty clear intent there. And judges so appointed then serve for 6-year terms, and then can, if they want to continue on the court, stand for retention. In other words, voters every 6 years have a chance to address the question, should this judge be retained on the court? And the constitutional language also says that judges shall not contribute to nor hold any office in a political party, nor take part in any political campaign, nor receive any fees or perquisites from any organization, nor hold any other office. So that language adopted in 1957 is very much in line with your the provision you have in your mission of a court system free from political influence. So that is obviously a very important element of the state constitution. And the third element, which is also being challenged, was adopted when the state did a whole series of reforms in the 70s, adopted a unified court system, which essentially said that the Kansas courts have to be function under the Kansas Supreme Court. Now, that structure that we adopted basically in the original Constitution and in these 2 amendments is what is under attack and has been attacked for the last 5 years. There's really a rising crescendo of assaults on independent judiciary, led by the governor and top legislative leaders who are throwing abuse of various kinds at judges and at court rulings. If you want to go look at one of Brownback's campaign commercials that appeared just before the last gubernatorial election, it was a taunt on activist judges, liberal judges, and really unfairly using the death penalty decision of the court to get himself elected. These same folks have threatened to shut down the courts with budget cuts. They've tried to abolish the constitutional procedures with on the selecting judges on the basis of merit. They've tried to undo the administration of the courts, threatening eliminating court funding. And last week, of course, they're proceeding with this impeachment provisions that would essentially let the legislature initiate impeachment if they don't like some court ruling. And obviously, given the litany of things I mentioned earlier, there are a number of constitutional issues or legislative actions that raise constitutional issues, like on school finance and refugee settlement. So what's going on here? Obviously, the governor and the majority of Republicans in the Kansas legislature do not agree with court rulings. And we can go into those, the school finance decisions, the appeals court made an abortion ruling, and these will be used against the courts. But what is clear to me was made clear to Tim Owens, State Senator Tim Owens, back a couple of years ago. Owens was chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and the governor was anxious to get the merit system issue on the ballot. And Owens quoted Brownback as saying this: "Let us change," and I'm quoting, "let us change the way we select judges so we can get judges who will vote the way we want them to," unquote. The message is quite clear. The governor and his allies in the legislature want to pack the courts. And they want to pack the courts with partisan judges. It's that simple. And where are we thus far? Some courageous legislators who actually believe in constitutional government have helped the courts deal with this. But I would say the legislative session is not over. Majority legislators may try again to put forward constitutional amendments that politicize or change the procedures for selecting judges. They may take action on court funding or who knows what in the remaining days of the session. If court intimidation through legislative action does not work and fails, which is possible even with this legislature, we may expect these lawmakers, along with allied groups, to campaign against judges who stand for retention in November. 5 of 7 Supreme Court justices will be on the statewide ballot in November for retention, and 6 of 14 Court of Appeals judges will be on the ballot. So they will likely be targeted. Kansans for Life has already targeted a number of judges, and groups opposing court rulings on school finance may weigh in as well. There was a death penalty group active in the last general election. And this is where an organization like yours, Women for Kansans, can, I think, play a critical role, because retention elections are not high-profile elections for the most part. Ballot fatigue weighs in, because these elections are clear at the very bottom of the ballot, and so a lot of folks don't make it that far. Groups will be campaigning for and against judges, and for the most part, these are not visible individuals, these individual judges, and I think there will be a great deal of confusion in who do you support, who do you retain, and who do you not retain. One thing that's interesting is that Brownback's only appointment to the Kansas Supreme Court, Stegall, will be on the ballot. So it'll be hard for some groups to say, go target those retention elections. They may target Brownback's own appointee. And the other thing that's pretty amazing is that the campaign finance laws in Kansas do not apply to these retention elections of state-wide judges. And so you're not going to know who is active in these campaigns. There are no reporting requirements. Who's contributing to voting for or against judges in these retention elections. So we all have our work cut out for us in sorting through these elections, but I cannot resist, and I know you are likely quite aware of these statistics, but I'm going to walk through them one more time. There are 20,525 registered voters in Cowley County. 20,525, that's October of 14, just before the 14 election. Now, that was an off-year election in terms of electing a president, but it was a highly contested election. The gubernatorial election was certainly that way, and we had a U.S. Senate election. All sorts of activity, campaigning went on, so this should have been high turnout, shouldn't it? Well, how many folks in Cowley County, how many of those registered voters voted?
Less than half.
What percentage would you guess voted?
50%. 30. 25,
I'd say 25.
Well, 10,071. Just less than 50%. Now that is lower than the state as a whole. So, and if you looked at the number voting for the governor's race, it was a larger number did not vote. And if you looked at the vote on the retention elections, 11,430 folks, Cowley County folks, did not vote on the retention of those two Supreme Court justices. Now, a switch of 200 votes in those retention elections, Cowley County would have essentially voted not to retain those two judges. We got work cut out for us. Let me just wrap this up and say I believe that Kansas courts have proceeded with diligence in interpreting the Constitution, as Alexander Hamilton articulated many years ago, and interpreting it for all Kansans. They provided a check on executive and legislative action that violates the Constitution. These checks and balances are the hallmark of democracy in the U.S. And an impartial judicial branch stands as a bedrock for our form of government. I urge you to remain aware that impartial justice and judicial independence are at risk in Kansas, and urge you to stand ready to oppose these attempts to pack the courts. And with that, I'm going to open it up, and we can go as long as you want. So, yeah.
As just a normal, average citizen that follows politics averagely, how do we know how to vote for those judges? And hypothetically speaking, if you're not a fan of Brownback, would you not vote to retain the judges, because then he's going to have the power to appoint more of his own judges?
Well, I would guess the Kansans for Life, maybe the state chamber, maybe Americans for Prosperity will target, I say.
So we just have to watch at the bottom of those
I-
advertisers who's sponsoring it?
Well, the problem is, you don't know, they don't have to report. It's not like a political, or a normal legislative campaign, a gubernatorial campaign. There are no campaign finance laws that apply to them. So they do not have to report on their, if they do ads or, voter guides. I think it's a challenge. I think because these elections will have a profile, they'll be reporting on them, and you'll have to rely on an independent press to say who's aligned and who isn't aligned in what ways. So it'll be a challenge.
And most people aren't going to know that.
And you're not just voting on retention of Supreme Court justice, you've got a Court of Appeals justice. And below that, there will be retention elections for many district court judges across the state. So to really sort through it, I would urge your organization to be active in this, to have independent kinds of educational work on who's who. It's possible to sort it out pretty clearly. So I would just say you got your work cut out for you. We all do, yes.
And Women for Kansas, the leadership team, we already had people that were putting together a voting guide. Now, I don't know, and I know that there will be, or I assume there will be, a voting guide for the Supreme Court justices and maybe the next tier down. I just don't know. But that is in the pipeline, and so that
Okay.
might serve as a kind of guide when we get it compiled and put out.
Yeah. And there's time to sort through this. We don't know what the legislature would do with respect to courts at this point. This impeachment thing seems to be moving now, whether the House has never seen it, so what they will do, I don't know. It's going to get some opposition for sure. Yeah.
Where is the language, the statutory or constitutional language that establishes a state board of education and delineates its powers and responsibilities? And in theory, does the legislature have the right to transfer the governance of school districts and their finances as they're proposing to do?
On the
Maybe I'm
chance-
asking you to maybe I'm asking you to make the decision for the court, I don't know.
On the chance that there would be questions of that kind, I brought a copy of the Kansas Constitution, which to me is fairly clear on that subject if you give me a minute to find it.
Ed, who puts out that little booklet you've got?
Well,
We might try to.
interestingly,
Get some.
the Secretary of State
Oh.
let me finish.
Joke of the day.
The Secretary of State used to.
Okay.
This has not been published. This has Ron Thornborough name on it. We don't publish this anymore, but I do happen to have my own.
The funds were
copy.
swept for the general fund.
Yeah, exactly.
In response to the question,
What a surprise, right?
here's the relevant language. The legislature shall provide for a state board of education which shall have general supervision of public schools, educational institutions, and all educational interests of the state.
Whoa.
Which would include financial interest.
I
Or
would think so.
arguably, I guess.
I mean, if in fact that bill I mentioned on transfer went forward, it'd be challenged. And then it'd be up to the court to interpret that. And when it says all educational interests of the state, except for school finance? No, I don't think so. I don't think so. Yeah.
I heard a rumor the other day, I'm assuming it's a rumor, but if the financing doesn't come through for education, is there a possibility our schools won't be able to open?
Well, the court, the Kansas Supreme Court, said, and let's review this a little bit. It was in 2014. Yeah, it was right before the election that the Kansas Supreme Court first said the funding that the legislature and the legislature provided, the governor signed, does not meet the equity requirements of the state constitution. In other words, wealthy districts could provide a higher quality of education than poorer districts, and the long-standing provision that that should not be the case. Anyway, before the election, well before actually, the court ruled that the school financing was not equitable. Guess what? The legislature and the governor quickly fixed it. Took about $100 million, and they said, all right, we'll fix it. This is 2014. In 2015, they said, the court approved it, the court signed off on what they did, we're not going to do that. They changed it. They reneged on their agreement of 2014. The school districts went back to court. This is not equitable. And so, when kind of trying to remember, so it was just in the last month or so, the court said, hey, you reneged. You got to go fix it. Now, we're not going to tell you how to fix it, but you have until June 30 to fix it. And if you don't fix it, we will declare the school finance provisions unconstitutional, and you'll be unable to finance the schools. So they essentially said, we're going to close the schools if you don't fix it. So and this is not out of the ordinary. It's happened in other states, but the courts, the court can't go in and say, do it this way. the only thing they can do is take fairly drastic action, and essentially, the schools are closed if you are not going to fund education equity. And that, you can understand that that's a fairly difficult position for the courts to take, but that's their only, I think they view that as their only avenue.
Anybody else have any questions? Linda?
I have a question that I asked you a year ago. It's not about school
Uh-oh.
finance. And your response was, it'll never happen. Things have changed a lot.
That's terrible to bring back something that I said.
The question that I asked, the governor and the legislator has already voted to request Medicare come to the state of Kansas in a block grant. And do I think it'll happen while Obama's in? Probably not. Do I think it's going to happen? Yes. I'm concerned that they're going to use that money like they've used all the other money to shore up their deficit so that the seniors and those soon-to-be seniors can use generic drugs, go to cheap doctors, to save the state of Kansas and keep big business alive and well. What are your thoughts on that?
I stand by my, it will never happen. Now, we got some people saying crazy things in this presidential election, so who knows how it'll come down. I just don't think they will, I mean, it's almost as, you know, a big a issue as Social Security. I just don't think they will threaten Medicare by somehow shifting it to the states or some regional group. I don't think it's going to happen. So I continue to hold that same point of view.
Oh, you're right.
I have one more question.
Go ahead.
The statistician at WSU that took the thing to court about the fairness of the ballots,
Yeah.
where is that at now?
Well, her particular request to audit ballots is probably not going to go anywhere. I think the legislature has moved or is moving a bill that does allow auditing of ballots under the by election officials. You know, I guess we'll see where that is going to go.
So it's just kind of stuck out there right now.
Back here first. Over here.
Yeah, what is your opinion on not expanding Medicaid in Kansas?
On the expansion of Medicaid?
Expansion,
Well, it's kind of interesting. Medicaid was authorized by Congress in 1965. Kansas immediately came into the system. Kansas has probably extended Medicaid in a variety of ways over, what now, 40-some years. Kansas also keeps costs down by not paying providers particularly well. And so the state's been sued on numerous occasions by doctors and hospitals and nursing homes and others. Probably I haven't kept track of all those. The interesting thing is, under the original Medicaid, Kansas gets reimbursement for about 60% of the expenditures. Medicaid's health care for poor folks. The Congress is now, under the Affordable Care Act, has authorized 90%, or more than 90% actually, coverage if Kansas would extend its its coverage in Medicaid. And we're resisting that. You know, Medicaid has lots of challenges, but there's something like 400,000 folks that benefit across Kansas that benefit from health care through Medicaid. And this would extend it to another 150,000. And the folks that are in charge, the governor and legislative leaders, are, quite frankly, and I wrote about this a couple of years ago, they are captured by folks like
Sorry.
It's all right.
I can't find it.
We'll take a short music break here.
the
That's okay.
governor and a majority of state legislatures essentially, in my view, are captured by folks like Americans for Prosperity that do not want any extension of a safety net.
Right.
I mean, it really boils down to that. They don't like the safety nets we have now,
Right.
and they certainly don't want them expanded. And so that's what these folks, I mean, when the Republican Party becomes nothing more than Americans for Prosperity, the State Chamber, the Rifle Association, Kansans for Life, that's what they get captured by, those organizations. That's their heart and soul.
But it's killing the hospitals, particularly the real hospitals.
Well, I made a few talks across the state before the election in 2014, and I was shocked at how many local elections, referendums, were being held to increase either sales taxes or property taxes to save the local hospital. And
It's happening in our city right now.
well, and
Wellington.
Sumner County was having an election. I was up in Phillips County, they were having an election. I mean, nobody keeps track of all this. I'd like to know how those numbers,
125 hospitals in Kansas are at risk of closing.
yeah.
125.
Well, and, you know, Medicaid not gonna save them, but it might let them rebalance and not essentially force local taxpayers, sales and property taxpayers, to be picking up the bill. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna probably ask for a 101, pretty basic here. The changes that were made in the tax laws recently that exempted business. When you say business, who does that really represent? Because anytime there's a suggestion, and there was again this week, there were 3 fairly brave senators who proposed some returning to taxing business, and the governor's spokesman said he'll veto it, it will never go anywhere. So, but describe what kind of business we're talking about. Are we talking about Spirit Aerospace, or are we talking about My Little Storage Bin LLC? I mean, what are we talking about? That's hard for me to capture a picture of what that is.
Well, for starters, every farm in this state.
So every farm.
So, and I don't know, those numbers I think are about 80 to 90,000. So,
And farms obviously have a wide range
yeah, I mean,
of the
but
man who
those are,
has 10 cows
big, I mean,
to,
there's some big
10,000.
operations and
Yes.
obviously getting bigger. Then there are the remaining 50,000 are so-called small, and the generic word is small business. And some of those are obviously quite small. I just looked at some numbers on that. I don't have them with me. But a huge percentage of those have business income of less than $25,000 a year. Those numbers I'm talking about looked at the top, those businesses that have business income $250,000 and above. That is 60% of the business income in Kansas, and it represents less than 2% of the businesses. The long and short of it is a small number of businesses are the ones that are receiving this benefit. Now, and I have to tell you, I don't understand completely the intricacies of the question you asked, but basically, national, international corporations like Spirit are not covered by this. They're covered under the corporate tax policy, and so they are. There is an income tax that still applies to corporate entities. But if the business files under Schedule C of the federal tax code, they're exempted, basically.
So wouldn't it be doctors, attorneys?
Yeah, I mean,
Dentists.
the inequity of
Dentists.
this,
And a whole bunch of folks like that have their own business?
I said earlier, unfair taxes seems to be one of the hallmarks of these current folks, and unfair in at least two ways. And it's most obvious in a doctor's office or a lawyer's office. Doctor and lawyer do not pay, and the clerk and secretaries essentially pay for state income tax. The other is this idea of shifting off the income tax, which is clearly the most equitable tax in terms of income. Everybody's got to eat. It's not, we don't spend the same amount on food, but when you have, we've got the highest sales tax on food in the country, and doesn't look like that's going to get corrected anytime soon, given our financial condition. But the income tax, with the income tax, you pay more equitably in terms of your personal income.
Anybody else have a question? Okay, Diane.
The death penalty case,
You know,
why was it?
why why this happen? Well, the critics have probably legitimate criticism here, and I can't say I understand all the intricacies, but we state legislature and the governor passed the death penalty back during Joan Finney administration. And we now have, I don't know, 8, 10, 12 folks on death row. They've been prosecuted and found to be guilty. But what the Supreme Court is doing is assuring that the procedures used in applying the death penalty are fair, according to other court cases, Supreme Court rulings, and so forth. And I think that they essentially got slapped down by the U.S. Supreme Court on one of their rulings, and they made a whole series of rulings, and we've never executed anyone thus far. But if I had to guess, I would guess there is not sympathy on the Supreme Court on the Kansas Supreme Court for the death penalty, and these justices are going out of their way a bit to make the procedures for applying it quite onerous. So I think that's what happened, and we'll see what's next there. They certainly have been roundly criticized, campaigned against on this death penalty ruling that they made, and that essentially the U.S. Supreme Court said no to them.
I continue to struggle with trying to think of a scenario that would acceptably define an equitable education across the state in different districts. I think of districts like northeast Kansas that have a pretty high tax base. Think of districts in southwest and western Kansas, totally rural. Assuming they had oil as a background, their tax base has almost gone to nothing. Is there anything that prevents the state from saying, okay, we have this pool of money, another 100 million, whatever, and we're going to distribute it in the following way, and that is, it means that Wyandotte County could have to increase their property taxes because they're not going to get as much as, let's say, Edwards County. They're going to get more. So I'm taking money out of one pocket and putting it in another at the expense of districts being forced to increase their own taxes. Is there anything that prevents the legislature from taking such a scenario?
Well, I had a hard time following that. The legislature has taken action to limit the taxing ability of wealthy districts in order to equalize local contributions. And of course, they have taken action to allocate state funds that benefit poor districts in order to equalize the funding. So they've done both of those, but I'm not sure I've answered your question.
Didn't the
No.
local option, I'm sorry,
Well,
did the local option budget seek to try to equalize some of that?
Yeah.
Where you might be, as a school district in the northeast, you might have to keep the amount that you levy somewhat lower in order to achieve the balance across the state, but at the same time, locally, you could add that which you would not have been able to add in order to do those other things. And, you know, that was the point, I believe, of the local option budget when it was in place. At least it was in the 90s when I was in the school board, but, you know, I've slept since then, so that can be
well, if you can imagine 280 school districts trying to consider the wealth of the school district, all these issues that, you know, how far they drive a bus to school, I mean, it is, and how many at-risk students they have. I mean, it's to make it equitable is a challenge, and you know, we've worked on this over many years, and the courts weighed in, legislatures and governors, and the courts have come to agreement on a number of occasions, but we're not there now, and that's why this is an ongoing issue.
Any other questions for Ed? Okay, well, let's give him a really big round of applause.